settings. So let's go ahead and get started with our very first demo, and that's going to be to see where it's a normal situation where we're going to be using window light. So for this demonstration, I'm going to shoot at 1/125th of a second at f2. And the reason for that is that most prosumer or entry-level prime lenses, if you will, are going to have an f-stop around f2, like the new Canon RF 85mm macro lens. And the reason for 1/125th of a second is that's about the slowest shutter speed that I could use probably before my shaky coffee hands get the best of me and we end up with motion blur. So that's going to be the bare minimum, and I'm just going to let the light dictate how bright our exposure. I'm just going to let the light coming through the window dictate what our ISO will be. So let's go ahead and get started with that very first test. Okay, so I've checked things out, and our exposure is going to be 1/125th of a second at f2 at 400 ISO according to my light meter. So let's go ahead and shoot the very first photos. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at these first few images and just make sure that we're on the right track technically. So the exposure on his face looks perfectly fine to me. It is sharp on his right eye, not his left. You can see these shadows are, well, they just don't have a lot of detail. We probably need to even this out a little bit, especially the black in his hair. So the best thing we could do at this point would just be to add a reflector, which is exactly what my mentor said that you should do back 25 years ago. Just use window light and a reflector. So let me go ahead and grab that reflector and move it into the shot. All right, let's go ahead and check that out once again and see if technically we're getting a better image now that we've moved the reflector in. Okay, so let's look at these on the laptop. And you can see once again that his hair still doesn't have enough detail to it. So I'm gonna have to move that in a little bit closer and just see how that ends up looking. Okay, well, I'm still looking at this image and I'm still seeing that there is really no detail in his hair, which is a little bit problematic. So we're gonna have to make some other hard decisions here. So I think I'm gonna just test out what would happen if I increase the exposure by 1 stop, just by moving the slider. And okay, well, I'd say that's an acceptable amount of detail. These highlights are a little blown, so I'll just pull them down a little bit. Okay, I think that looks fine. It's workable, this image. I'm just gonna go ahead and zero out the exposure and increase the exposure on my camera by 1 stop. Okay, so I increased that exposure by increasing the ISO from 400 to 800. So let's take a look at these images. Once again, Capture One has automatically applied that highlight correction. The other thing, a lot of times in the base characteristics, I will shoot in film standard. It might have been using high contrast, and that might have been throwing us off a little. I would say that looks pretty good overall. It's not the best image, but we do have some highlights and some shadows. Now, one of the things I should say, we have detail in the highlights and the shadows. So one of the problems that you encounter when you're shooting at f2 is that a lot of times lenses are not at their sharpest until you get up near the mid-range of the f-stop range. So around 5.6 or f8. The other problem oftentimes is that lenses will exhibit chromatic aberration when you're shooting very close to wide open or wide open. So at f2 on that RF 85mm f2 lens, when I tested it out a few months ago, there was a fair amount of chromatic aberration until you stop down a little bit. With this particular lens, which is the Canon RF 85mm 1.2, when I'm stopped down to F2, you're not going to see any chromatic aberration, but that might be something to think about in general. The other thing is that when you're shooting at 1/125th of a second, you might end up with motion blur because of the model's, maybe you've captured the model while they're switching from one pose to another, or again, you're shaking a little too much. So shooting at 1/125th at F2 is not ideal. It's just a situation where you can scrape by. So now the next thing we need to talk about is, what if your client said to you that you needed more depth of field? So for me, in my day job, often shooting haircuts, if you can believe that or not, I am shooting at around F8 almost all of the time. And that's so that I can get detail in both the subject's eyes and throughout their haircut. If I'm shooting at 1/125th of a second at F2, I'm only going to end up with his eyes in focus, not the tip of his nose or his ear. So if I end up needing to have his entire head in focus in order to get that depth of field, I'm going to have to stop down to around F8. And that's going to mean that I'm going to have to increase my ISO. So right now I'm at 800 ISO shooting at F2. That would mean that I'm going to end up going to 1600 ISO for 2.8, 3200 ISO for F4, 6400 ISO for 5.6, and 12,800 ISO for F8.